Shermon Cruz, chair at the Association of Professional Futurists, executive director and chief futurist at the Center for Engaged Foresight in Manila, Philippines. Is that right? That's a
Yes,
lot of
yes,
information there.
it is. It is.
Can you expand a little on what a professional futurist is and what we're talking about when we talk about futures literacy?
Oh, yes, of course. What a futurist do is that they study the future. They study the future in ways by which, they can actually make sense of it. Like, for example, history, when we use the past, it gives us some sort of a grounding and context about what led us to the present, and using the narrative and the learnings that we had in the past, we try to reflect on that and make decisions today. So similarly, a futures thinking, or what a futurists do, is that they consider the future as some sort of a forward-looking view of history, right? So we study the future to make sense of something that doesn't exist yet, and that it hasn't occurred yet. And if something doesn't exist yet, the future is literally open, something that you can actually shape, imagine, anticipate, invent, make assumptions about. And using your imagination and your power or mental propensity to anticipate possibilities, you use them or use this as some sort of information to help you make decisions today.
What things you mentioned history, which I think is because it actively repeats itself constantly, right? Or what part of history do you think helps to form that future or helps you to see that future? Is it human behavior in general, or
in the context of perception, I would say not necessarily right away into that domain of behavior, but of course, the past has always been an important element, or perhaps way of knowing that informs and influences the way we make assumptions today. And using the past to help us make some sort of an understanding or way of perceiving the present. So in the same manner, the difference between the past and the future is that the past has already been written, and the future is about to be written, right? So, and we write about the future in the present. In fact, we plant the seeds of the future today. So, as futurists, we study the future that isn't there yet, literally not there yet, and it remains invisible. It remains to be written. And when you have that opportunity to actually shape, create, or invent it, whatever you might call it, or prefer to call it, it gives you some sort of power and agency and choice to actually shape and design it today. So that's what a futurist do.
Do you believe, or how much do you believe in our own agency to create the future? In just general public, not politicians, right? Our own, just people. How much agency do you actually think we have in creating that future that you were talking about?
Yeah, yes. That's the point of futures literacy, right? The point of futures literacy is that you get to know and be conscious about your ability, natural propensity, I would say, right, to anticipate possibilities. We do that on a daily basis, right? Like whether simple things, like, for example, you wake up in the morning, you try to anticipate or perhaps plan, at least within those sphere of environment wherein you have a control, like, for example, your office or your room or your kitchen or your house, right? So when you wake up in the morning, you get to plan, right? And in the process of mentally planning, let's just say, you think of possibilities, right? Like you anticipate them. But then, of course, if a person isn't a future literate, they anticipate on a daily basis, but perhaps being unconscious about this propensity to anticipate.
Okay.
So if you're unconscious about it, then we could perhaps safely say that you do not have the agency to use the future because you're unconscious about it. You know, you just think that it's just there, right?
It's
Without
just happening.
having,
You're just going with the
yeah, it's
flow.
just
Yeah, yeah.
happening, right? Like it's automatic, right? So, but then if a person is future literate, you become conscious about your power to anticipate things. So when you're conscious about that propensity, or I would say power to anticipate things, you gain that capability or ability, or I would say if it's a skill set, a competency to use it to your advantage as an asset, a tool, or a resource to shape the future today. So the ability to shape the future today is an agency, right? Because we make choices on a daily basis. And when a person is future literate and we make choices about the future, whether that is short term and more importantly about things that are longer term in orientation, we get to have a sense that we have a vision about our personal futures, right? So if we have visions about our future, and then it becomes, I would say that would be equivalent to some sort of an agency.
So the first step would be to be able to anticipate, and then with the awareness of the anticipation, you would gain that agency. Often do you think people think about long-term future in general? Because short-term is something that's a little bit easier, I think, but medium long-term, do you think that's something that people do on a regular basis?
No, not necessarily. No, in fact, now, there's this thing that the future is called the nowist syndrome, right? Or the nowist dilemma. Like that each and every day, the things that we do is always about the now. It's always about the short term. So we're fixated, in the past, definitely. Yes, right. Like, so if you're fixated about the past, there is a larger possibility that you're actually fixated about the present as well. So if you're over too fixated about the present, when you think about the future, it's always about the immediate future. It's in fact that influences, as you just mentioned, behavior, right? Because if we're too overly focused, right, in the short-term future, like for example, the next 2 weeks, or the next 6 months, or the next 3 years, we tend to give value to status quo, right? Like as if the only reality that you have is the business as usual or the status quo, right? And that, in fact, is what planning is all about, particularly when we talk about strategic planning. And
Changing
decision
the
making, in
status
fact,
quo.
yeah, it's just about the short-term future, right? The next day, the next week, the next month. And then, of course, if you try to think about the kind of stuff and things that we normally have, at least mentally, about the short-term future, is just about material things, but yeah, and money and those kinds of stuff. And we tend to forget about human relationships, family, the future, just nature, which are long-term in orientation, right? Rivers and plants and those kinds of stuff. So we tend to emphasize and accentuate the value of material stuff and things. If you're a nowist individual or person, you just don't think about the long-term implications of these things. But then, of course, when you're a future literate, other than the fact that perhaps you're conscious about the future, and in fact, this is, I would say, is particularly true as well, that when you are future literate, it doesn't necessarily mean as well or automatic that you are a long-term thinker, right?
Okay.
You're just conscious about tomorrow, but not necessarily about the long arc of the future, like generational futures, right? So it's not automatic. But then, of course, the fundamental and foundational to, I'm sorry, long-term thinking is that you have to be conscious about the future, right? That you have to be conscious that each and every decision and choice that we make as persons, as parents, or as decision makers, or as CEOs, or as what policymakers, or bureaucrat or civil servant, especially in the area of public policy and governance, is that the implications of these things that we do are long-term, really in impact, right? We might not be seeing it now, but then when you talk about the policy things that we shape and curate, the implication and impact are felt, in a decade, or in 30 years, or in 50 years. And then when we try to look back, right, and then when, for example, we did not succeed or fail in the effort of changing the business as usual or the status quo, that we tend to hear people conclude that is because, or it is due to lack of foresight, right? Or the inability to think in terms of long term, right? Yeah. And I would say, the values that informs and drives short-termism, or perhaps the values that emerge in a short-term orientation or oriented individual is mostly, the propensity is the bias towards extraction. The propensity is biased towards consumption. The propensity is biased towards waste, right? Those kinds of stuff. Yeah, I would say. Yeah.
But when you think about the future, what you're mentioning, I think it implies some kind of philosophical view of the future, of where you would like it to go, right? Like a mission or a vision of something. I don't know how common that is. Like, it is existentialist in a sense, like what you're proposing, right? I don't know how common that is in everyday life. We're in a little bit of an existential crisis at the moment, don't you think?
Right. That's a good way of putting it, because when we think about the long-term future, or let's just say the intergenerational futures, we think about future generations, or perhaps nature in the next 30 to 50 years, and placed in the context of being accountable and responsible in the way we think, the way we do, the way we act and reflect, is our issues of value judgments. Right? What are the values that I'm not willing to compromise, right? Or perhaps willing to compromise. So when it comes to the long-term future, it's really a conversation about value judgments, right? Those things that are important to you as a human being. Yeah. So yes, I agree that this is where the philosophical domain comes in, the existential aspect of our reality, penetrates the conversation. So yes, it is, right?
Sherman, you mentioned, I've heard futurists talk about futures in plural, right? And you mentioned today all futures are essentially open, right? Why
Mhm.
is this perspective so important when we're talking about futurists and the work of futurists and being future literate?
Yes, there is this assumption among futurists a decade ago that the future isn't singular, right? That it isn't linear, and that there is no one single future out there. And challenging that initial assumption, which was informed by the idea of forecasting and prediction, decades ago. We've seen that in many reports, in many papers and predictions, from doom and gloom to continued economic growth. They had this view that there is only one single future out there, and that is either it's growth forever, right? Or that it's a darkness perpetually, right? Like doom and gloom. So they love to predict those things, right? But apparently, several scholars later on would realize that perhaps there's something wrong, dysfunctional about these assumptions about the future, as if it is already written by a person by a bank, by a government, by a dictator, or whatever you might call them or call it, is the idea that if the future does not exist yet, and it implies implicitly that it is open and that we can shape and create it, then it also means that we can actually anticipate and imagine plural worlds, right? So if a plurality is possible in a future world that doesn't exist yet, then it should be futures, right? Yes.
But when we're talking about futures, surely there is some kind of distinction between, I mean, not everything is open, right? Some futures are more probable or more likely than others. Let's say, like, um, a zombie invasion is not very probable, and maybe not having water in 100 years is a little bit more likely, right? Like, where do you draw that line? Is it useful to look at all the scenarios? Like, how do you filter out what you think is more probable and what you think won't, and what is actually worth pondering about?
Yes, yes. Futures and foresight as a practice is really about speculation, right? Even predictions are speculative, whether we like it or not, whether we accept it or we argue about it. The way I see it is that predictions, by by its context and epistemology are pure speculations, including those that we project into the future. Whether it's 3, 5 years or 30, 50 years, we make projections about the future. These are speculations as well. So what does an open future actually mean, at least implicitly, is the idea of potential futures. So when we view or study the future in the context of potentiality, is that there are a variety of potential futures. So the projected future, like just what you mentioned about, okay, the highly likely future out there, particularly if, let's just say, in the next 3 to 5 years, is in fact a potential future, right? No one knows whether if
Yeah.
your projections indeed will come true, right? Because there are many variables that you need to consider that will definitely influence or change your projection if you are evidence-based driven. So we acknowledge that, of course. And then, of course, you also have probable and possible futures, those things that could happen or might likely happen, right? But then, of course, these are potentialities as well. And then you also have the plausible future, right? Which is the domain of decision-making and choice, right? This is where the conversation about the visions about the future. Visions are not projections, right? They are choices of preferable future. We make choices about these things. Regardless of our belief or perhaps stance, whether these are possible or potential, we still envision them anyway. Yeah, because we believe in it. There is a degree of belief and intuition and human judgment and motivation and inspiration, despite the fact that we see them as moonshots, right? But then we still envision them, right? Like, landing on the moon, right? Like, given the constraints that you have, in terms of technology, resources, human capital, it's just so impossible. But then there are people in organization that go beyond the projected, the possible and the probable, and the plausible, and they prefer, to envision the preferable, which, of course, would eventually define who they are, right? As nations, as communities, as leaders. But then, of course, there is also what you call the preposterous future. The future that no one believes will ever happen, simply because you don't have the data to actually support it. They are just absurd and ridiculous and crazy and preposterous. But then they still consider it as a potential future, right? In fact, Albert Einstein said this once, that if an idea is not absurd, it is useless. There are people who think beyond and aspire beyond the projected, the possible, the probable, and the plausible future, even beyond the preferable. But they some sort of imagine the preposterous. And in fact, this is what makes futurists pretty quite a futurist, right? Like what defines a real futurist are those who really like, figure out ways to enable the preferable to occur, and then to see the invisible, the emergent, which is of course the preposterous as well. In fact, there's this a second law of the future, humorously stated by Jim Bader, one of my heroes, hero futurists. He once said that the second law of the future is that if an idea is ridiculous, then it might not be the future at all. So any future idea at first must seem ridiculous, because if it is not, it might not
It's
even
the
be the
status
future
quo.
at all.
Yeah, because you're just constrained by the reality of where you're at now, which is not really the
Right.
future, at least not in the long term, right? But it
Yes.
requires certain um liberation, maybe from reality as we know it now, and the idea, like you said, of what is possible. And creativity, I imagine, is a skill that is really necessary to be able to think about a preposterous future. It might be preferable or not, right? But I imagine creativity is a skill that's necessary. What other skills are necessary to cultivate in order to be future literate?
Oh yes, of course, this. That we've seen that that artists, right, live on the edge of a reality, right? Like for example, what comes to mind would be like John Lennon or Paul McCartney or Elvis Presley or something, or Picasso or
Yeah, yeah.
Leonardo da Vinci. They have always been at the edge of reality, right? These people, would challenge the norms, right? And we've seen in the past that they would always be considered some sort of outcasts or crazy or ridiculous, and yeah, we've seen this in the past. And in fact, this preposterous thinking personalities, and I would say organizations, like for example, Apple, right? Like, would just create things that doesn't exist yet, right? And then when they were able to manifest, their ideas, through creativity and rigorous imagination and hard work as well, would create new types of new normal, right? Like, and new realities eventually in the process. It takes time to do that, but then of course in this day and age, I would say the reality almost always changes on a daily basis, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, every day it's changing because of frontier technologies, because of there is this are not one of my heroes is of course my national hero. His name is Jose Rizal, right? He was a revolutionary during the Spanish period, during the time of the colonization in the Philippines, when Spain colonized the country. And they had a different era, it was a different generation. They were fighting for freedom, they were fighting for freedom of speech. The Bill of Rights that we all enjoy today, there at some period in our history, people were actually fighting for it. They were ready to die for it. And that wasn't the reality that they had back then. And then 50 to 100 years after, that's the reality that we enjoy now. So, and then he said that let the genius burst forth everywhere, right? Let the genius burst forth everywhere. And that was way back in 18th century, late 18th century, and he said that, okay, how might we be able to enable the genius to burst forth everywhere? He was saying that one way of actually like doing that is through arts, right? Yes, arts is, there's this Indian philosopher who said that arts can penetrate where the rays of the sun cannot, right? Arts can penetrate consciousness, arts can penetrate the human spirit, the human soul. So through arts, we get to rethink and reframe and reinterpret reality as we know it today. And he said that, among other things, art can actually enable the genius to just burst forth everywhere. And we've seen that in the last 200 years. It's crazy, right? Yeah. And that is now even becoming more evident. Now, imagine today that everyone become future literate, that everyone develop this competency and capability and consciousness about their power to actually shape and imagine and create, make visible the things that are invisible today. What if, a majority of our population, let's just say global population, has the opportunity to actually curate, design, and imagine the future, right? Providing them the platform and the space, the opportunity, to just invent them and create them and have the opportunity to interact with others and just build new things together. What would the world look like 100 years from now? Let's just say, right? 2100 or perhaps 2123. Or say this, right? What kind of world would that be, right? Like, crazy. My daughter and I was playing several days ago. I was asking her, she's 5 years old, that what would it look like for you, if you're going to have some sort of a space adventure, Sophie, what would your space adventure be? And then she told me that, Daddy, I would like to build a rocket that flies around the sun and have a picnic on the moon. She told me about that. I'm like, wow, that's crazy, right? Like, she wants to build a rocket that could fly around the sun and that she could have a picnic on the moon, right? Like, that's a different imagining for a 5-year-old kid. When I was 5-year-old, I did not have any access to information. I was just relying on my teacher in the kindergarten school, in my public school.
And probably somebody
what...
would tell you that it's preposterous. Stress Sherman.
Right.
It's not possible.
Yes. But now, today, if you come to think about it, because of the emergence and the emergencies that are going on in the world today, is just I think it just speeds up things, right? Like we are in a period of perhaps of like what happened during the Renaissance period. This is just my assumption, but I'm seeing a period wherein we're in a world, in an era of what I might call a new Renaissance era, right? Yes, like what happened in
Everything
Florence,
is
right?
changing. All the rules are changing. Everything is
Everything.
coming out. Sherman, I have a question for you. I love what you said about letting the genius burst forth everywhere. I work in innovation in my company, right? And we work with a lot of tech companies. So what obviously there is a big importance, or it's really important for people to be able to reimagine future and to let companies have to have some kind of policy to let the geniuses burst forth. What could enable spaces and platforms for that to happen? Today you said that it was important to have a space and a platform for that to happen. How can companies enable that so that the geniuses can burst forth and foresee possible futures?
Yeah. Today, we've been seeing a lot of opportunities and spaces by which people can actually collaborate, co-create ideas, express what they have in mind. And there are emerging disciplines today, like for example, not just futures thinking. You have design thinking, systems thinking, complexity thinking. Different types of thinking are just popping up here and there, and a number of people great this new ideas and mental models and thinking sets are being democratized at different levels, at the highest level of from the board of directors to the prime ministers, to schools. They've been trying to figure out ways by which they can actually democratize access and what make this types of knowledge widespread. They are even creating versions for kids now, right, to enable kids to access these types of knowledge at a very young age through different medium and media. The social media, of course, while there are negative things that we have seen as far as the implications of social media is concerned, but then, of course, there are a lot of positive impacts as well, right? As far as wherein knowledge are spread in breadth and depth, in different directions. It's just so many, right? Like, trying to reflect on the billions of content that has been posted, different platforms in the last 10 years is just so, unimaginable, right? Like billions of content, right? And you can access them for free, right? Like it's just, anything that you have in mind, and especially now that you have, for example, generative platforms like ChatGPT, right? Like it just significantly reduce your time, trying to figure out the things that you're not aware about or you don't know, right? And it just, so quick. And yeah, and new spaces and platforms continue to emerge. And then now, in fact, there's this thing that futurists call the emergence of new types of craftsmanship, right? That combines the body, mind, spirit in crafting new products and services. So it's just crazy, right? Like, yeah.
But you mentioned the word thinking like 10 times while you were talking, right? And I agree with you that there's so much more information around, but I'm a little more pessimistic in thinking that there's not that much thinking going on in general. I don't think because we don't want to. I think in general, our lives are pushing us towards these sort of autopilot lives. We're just going in and everything is urgent and everyone's burnt out and there's so much information. How much thinking do you think is actually going on? And how can we foster thinking, which is probably one of the most critical skills for the future?
Right.
How do you think we could do that?
Yes. You're right. I totally agree with you 100%. While there is an increase in information available in data and knowledge and intellectual stamina, but then of course there is also an increase in stupidity, right? Yeah.
I didn't want to put it like that.
Yeah. Of course, Albert Einstein have said something about this, right? Like there are two things that are infinite, right? And one is stupidity, right? Of course, we have to acknowledge that fact, right? And stupidity occurs when there's lack of thinking in processing all of the information and knowledge that we do. And that's why you have this information, right? Like, and that's a fact. And conspiracy theories and among other things. Why does this, a phenomena emerged in the first place? Because of the lack of thinking, or perhaps a reflection on the information that we read and we download and among other things, right? Because there's too much information overload, and it's not just it's just difficult, right? Like to actually have the opportunity to think nowadays. But then, of course, there's also an antidote to that, in fact, right? But this is something that perhaps we need to work on, is reflecting our ability to be more cognitive, right? Like just reflect and be aware about our ability to reflect and feel and imagine and those things that happens in the human mind, right? So to churn all of these realities that we have, both perhaps externally and I think more importantly internally, which is a cognitive thing. So I think what we need to do is not really about, of course, learning the tools and the methods and the information and knowledge and data is very important. But then we have to remember that the magic, in fact, the power of these things happen, they emerge when we give value to our ability to actually make sense of these things, and which is the area of cognition, right? I've been seeing a lot of new versions and iterations, of design, futures, foresight, systems thinking. And they've been calling this in different names, 2.0, 3.0, 4.0. And what I've seen is that there is a pattern among these different thinking styles that has emerged for tools and methods recently, is that authors are now saying that we have to bring back cognition into the conversation. right? So the cognition, the quality of thinking and cognition that we put into all of the things that we do is what makes it powerful and magical. Without it, it's useless. You know, future thinking tools, methods are useless if we don't accentuate and highlight and outline, right? Like and emphasize, the power of cognition. And there are many ways to actually do that, right? Like both internally and external processes, like conversations such as this, amplifies the power of human cognition. And I think in the day and an emerging age or era of artificial intelligence, is we tend to underestimate ourselves, especially when we're faced with something unknown or novel or new. That's human nature, right? We invent these things, right? But then we're faced with artificial intelligence. And there is this view that, and I think, is that we tend to underestimate the ability, the plasticity of the human brain, the elasticity of human cognition, right? And I think eventually, right, like we created these things, we will evolve faster than perhaps compared to what, 10, 15,000 years ago. So human evolution and human consciousness will evolve much faster in an age of artificial intelligence. We're going to figure it out. We're going to beat AI at the end. We'll figure it out, right?
If we think.
Perhaps if we think, and then, yeah, if we reflect and think and make sense about all of these things, yeah, there are many ways to actually like expand human consciousness, right? We might not have really looked into it or perhaps studied it. Like, for example, let's just say self-transcendence, right? Of course, AI can't transcend, right? There's no such thing as transcendence in artificial intelligence. Yeah, they're gonna do the intelligence stuff, but then once AI, does or do the intelligence things that we've been doing in the last 15,000 years of human civilization, that will perhaps give us the opportunity to invest more time on transcendence. Yeah, I see it as such, right? Like,
how can we live in an era of tips? I have a podcast, and people when they listen to the podcast they're like, yeah, but like I like tips at the end. What tips can we give people who might be listening to this to see how they can either themselves or enable spaces within their companies to increase cognition and increase thinking? I mean, obviously, being aware of yourself and thinking about your purpose and the things that you like and how you envision the future, but also just in general. How can we do that, like in a practical sense?
Yeah. One is that you need to have opportunities and conversations, like this, right? It's not just about work. It's not just about routine and productivity and goal, efficiency and effectiveness, optimizing strategy, among other things. But it will burn you out somewhere along the way, right? I think you need to have spaces for meaningful conversation like this, right? We need to like provide opportunities for people to amplify their life skills, right? Like critical thinking, creativity, imagination, those things that we need in life, to excel and be good and be valuable and useful, not just to ourselves or our company, but our community, the people that we love, our family and the planet as well. And, have some time for arts, painting, right? Like meditation, reading books, travel places, ask questions. These are practical things that you don't need a lot of money to do all of these things, right? Invest on lifelong learning, right? Instead of buying very expensive watches or clothes. But then, of course, these are people choices. But if you really want to be happy, right? If you really want to be happy or have a more meaningful and relational life positively, is that you have to invest more time with nature, with people, with family, those things that are important to you as a human being. Yeah. Yeah.
Excellent. Sherman, one last question before you, because it's really late for you. I could continue this conversation for hours, but maybe we we have to do this at another time. I know that you have a card, right? The Disruptions Foresight game or something. Can you tell me a little bit about how it works, where you use it, and maybe give us like a couple of examples? And I don't know if it's available online and it's something that people can buy. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes, yes. The Dreams and Disruption is now, available. You can actually like order the Foresight game by going to the dreamsanddisruptions.com. And the idea why, I invented the game is to question our assumptions and, perhaps question the way we do foresight today, right? In traditional foresight, classical foresight, the way we've been doing foresight in scenarios in the last 30 to 50 years is that we get to choose our drivers of change. We get to rank them. We get to scope them. We choose them. We have the luxury to actually, as if we can actually like choose them, right? Okay, political driver plus economic driver, right? Technology driver, societal. But then the real world doesn't work like that. The real world doesn't give you a choice, really, right? Like, to a certain extent, it doesn't, right? Like, especially today, perhaps in the last 30 to 50 years, life were pretty much more laid back and we're still trying to figure out
It's
our
simpler.
way and amplify, our purpose to grow our wealth. And among other things, information was quite not really accessible. There weren't a lot of data back then, right? Everything was textual. But today, it's far more complex than that. And that we learned that, all of the forces of change are interacting with each other. There are tensions and dynamics between politics and technology, economics and spirituality, religion and culture, among other things. And we get better at making sense of them. And now we realize that these things are complex and that things are more frequently being impacted by randomness, right?
Yeah.
So that was the point of the game. Like the question was, what about randomness in the way we build scenarios? What about randomness in the way we imagine the future? What about randomness in the way we prepare for crisis or emergencies? And decision-making and among others. That's the point of the game, right? It's a card game. It's a scenario foresight game that incorporates randomness. The reason why I accentuated it, I did a research on this as well, just to some sort of validate and check, cross-validate my assumptions as well, is that I learned from Nassim Nicholas Taleb, who is an economist and a mathematician as well. He said that complex systems are weakened or even killed in the absence of randomness, in the absence of stressors. So, okay, right? So, but then, of course, before we don't actually stress test the scenarios. We don't. We just build the scenarios of transformation. We're good. We're happy. This is the preferable future. This is utopia. Let's go for it, right? Like the world doesn't work like that, right? Like there's no free lunch in this world. Visions are not automatic. You cannot like convince people right away, right? They're gonna hate you for it, or they're gonna support you for that, right? But then that's how the real world works. Now you need to have to stress test those scenarios, right? How do you make it adaptive? How do you make it anti-fragile, right? So you have to stress test it. Yeah, but then of course it's not just about the scenarios. There are end users of our scenarios. Somebody has gonna read it. You're gonna have to submit this to your boss or your politician, or the military will definitely like read it, among others, and they have a different way of looking at the world. So the way perhaps that you build the scenarios, you give it to this person or this organization, they're going to see it differently, right? It depends on the interest that they have. It depends on, their end game, right? So it will change, right? The military will see the value of artificial intelligence different from a capitalist, right? If you come to think about how they build and make sense of artificial intelligence, two different worlds, right? So the capitalists, like technology developers, corporations, would always talk about profit, efficiency, effectiveness, right? Making the data processing much quicker, And then, however, the military will see it in a different way for national security purposes, for violence, you know. So the game includes those kinds of dimensions, so that when we build scenarios, it's where you blend utopia and dystopia in the way we see the world, right?
Okay.
Yeah, yeah. So it's chaotic, right? So you have to some sort of appreciate it and understand that the world and human nature functions like this, both positive and negative. So you have to find some sort of a balance in the way you do these things, right? Well, it's good to be hopeful. Yeah, I'm an incorrigible optimist. But then, of course, hopefulness could also lead to anxiety, right? Like there's such a thing as what we call toxic positivity, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, you become biased about your optimisms, right? Like, we
You're
have to
sort
be
of
aware
based, you don't
about
want to
those
look
things.
at anything. It's denial, really.
It is, it is,
It
it
looks
is,
a
right?
lot
Like,
like denial.
yeah, and we've seen the horrors in the past. Their visions of utopia would lead to what? To genocide because of their visions of hopeful visions about themselves, their
Yeah.
nation, and their religion.
Yeah.
It led to massacre, and genocide. We've seen that in the last 200 years. So what I'm saying here is that by playing the dreams of disruption, you get to acknowledge and perhaps question, the interface of hope and fear, right? Of yin and yang and positive and negative things, and we get to decide by the power, of course, of human choice of what we're going to do about this. Right? Yeah, what policy or innovation strategy that I'm going to do and build now that I'm aware about these things could go wrong and these things could go right, like so, or perhaps both.
Yeah. It's always
Yeah.
going to be a little mix. Sherman, do you have online workshops that you provide companies with, or do you work mostly with governments?
Yeah, I do consulting work for companies, corporations, and governments, including communities and civil society groups. It depends, the kind of invitation that I get from people in organization, that becomes my entry point. But really, a huge part of my portfolio's consultancy. Yeah. So I provide through consultancy, it could either be like some sort of providing advice, mentorship, and coaching to CEOs and leaders and policymakers. Another one is providing capacity building for organizations, like those who would want to learn futures literacy or strategic foresight. What are the tools and methods that we can use and learn and apply in our own organizations. So from using foresight to planning, strategy, innovation, and those things that you wish to perhaps apply and use foresight. From business process development, risk
Yeah,
management.
in innovation
Yeah,
departments, for example, I can see it
right.
being extremely useful. I'm going to leave the link to your website at the bottom of the video after. All right, so just to end this, can you ask us 3 questions that will get us thinking about the future? What 3 questions would you ask somebody so that when they press stop in this video, they think a little bit more about their future and their agency to change those preferable futures, like you said?
Yes, that's a good question. Now, what I would say is, of course, it's very important that you have to start with some existential questions, right? Like, for example, who am I? Right? That question is pretty quite open and subjective. It gives you the power and the agency to actually shape and invent identity. The choices that you make, the future that you want to create for yourself. Another question would be, what is my purpose in this life, right? What exactly is my purpose? Does those that are the purpose that I have discovered now can be repurposed in an AI world, right? Uh, yes, and of course, what is the meaning of life, right? Life is a collision with the future. It has always been like that, right? It's really about, bottom line is about life, right? What is the meaning of life? What is the meaning of my life, right? So if life is a collision of the future, then we have to be ready about it. We have to be prepared for it. So and anticipation is key to preparation. And when we prepare, I have this saying or proverb, which I have subscribed to over the years, in the last 10 years of my career, and of course my life as well, as that victory loves preparation, right? And I would change that, perhaps victory loves anticipation, right? So yeah,
I love it.
that that that
All right.
that 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 would be.
Thank you so much, Sherman. I loved having this conversation with you.